Hey folks, it's Toby Vance from Darwin's Pit Bull. We got a new topic up for discussion today. Today we're going to be talking about factual evidence for evolution. This is going to be part one in a series that we're going to do on factual evidence that supports evolution. In today's topic, we're going to be talking about genetic evidence, evidence from DNA that shows without a shadow of any doubt that evolution happened. So follow me on over into the presentation and let's take a look at this evidence today. Okay, so today we're talking about factual evidence for evolution. And the piece of evidence we're going to look at today is evidence from our DNA. This is one of the most solid pieces of evidence that evolution occurred. And it's one that you're going to see that there absolutely is no creationist counter-argument to it. This is evidence from what we call endogenous retroviruses. We call them ERVs for short. Now, an ERV is a virus that infects a cell, and when it infects a cell that is a germ cell, that is either a sperm or an egg cell, it becomes permanent in the DNA. Basically what it does is when it inserts itself into the DNA, it essentially creates a scar in the DNA. And when that occurs in a germ cell, it becomes permanent in the DNA from that point onward for any offspring that comes from that individual. A little bit how this process works. You start with the retrovirus, which we can see right here. This virus moves until it attaches itself to the wall of a cell. It peels open the wall of the cell and inserts itself in. We call that process endocytosis. Once inside, the coating comes off and the viral RNA is released. This viral RNA then begins to create a copy of a section of DNA. Okay, we call that process reverse transcription because normally DNA, which is down here in the nucleus, creates copies of RNA to go form proteins. But here we have the reverse happening. We have RNA forming a string of DNA. Once it does so, okay, this viral DNA then moves itself into the nucleus, finds a place in your DNA strand and inserts itself. Okay, that's what's going on right here. Once it does that, it is then capable of using your DNA to make copies of itself as RNA, and it does so. And this viral RNA then assembles itself as it was previously, exits out the cell, okay, through this budding process, creating a new coating, and then this new virus then moves on and finds another cell to insert itself into. Now, the important point about this to understand, because I understand this is a very complex process, but the really important part to understand is the DNA scarring process, because that's what we're looking at here, because this is the evidence for evolution. That occurs right here whenever that viral piece of DNA inserts itself into your DNA. Okay? We get a scar, and that scar is permanent when it occurs in a germ cell. So why is that important? Well, let's go ahead and look at a comparison between human and chimpanzee DNA. Okay, when we look at human and chimpanzee DNA, as we can see here, we have the DNA of a human on the left side, and we have the DNA of chimpanzee on the right side, and we then have all 23 chromosomes of human DNA and all 24 chromosomes of chimpanzee DNA. Chimpanzee DNA differs in ours only in here in chromosome 2, where chimpanzee DNA is split into 2 chromosomes. Ours is not. It's one single strand. Okay. So when we pair them side by side like this, what we find is that in 16 locations, there are matching ERV scars in both human and chimpanzee DNA. This is scarring. This is something that is not natural to the DNA, but yet it's in exactly the same location in both human and chimpanzee DNA. Now, if these viruses were just randomly inserting themselves into both our DNA and chimpanzee DNA, the likelihood of them just accidentally, randomly scarring the exact 16 same locations in both human and chimp DNA would be 1 in 2.06 to the 138th power. Okay, that's a number that's so large I couldn't even put it here on the slide. It's basically a number that means that it's impossible. There's no way that this randomly occurred by chance, that these ERVs just happened to wind up in the exact same spots in both human and chimpanzee DNA randomly by accident. They're in the same spot because we have a common ancestor. That's the explanation that makes the most sense. Okay. Here we have a chart that shows various species: humans, chimps, gorillas, orangutans, gibbons, old world monkeys, new world monkeys. And it shows essentially the evolutionary branches that led to all of us. And what you see here are various ERVs that inserted at various locations. Now, how do we know that? We know that because, for instance, these ERVs here are common to all of these species. So because we have these ERV scars in all of our DNAs in exactly the same location, that tells us that they were infected somewhere way back here in a common ancestor to all of us. Then we have these ERVs here, which infected the common ancestor of these species, because these species have the scars in common. And so on. You can see these ERVs here are only common to these species here. These ERVs here are only common to these 4 species. These ERVs here are only common to these 3 species. These ERVs here are only in humans. They're in nothing else. So we know that these infections occurred sometime at some point during our own species history, after we had evolved from all of these other various species. Okay, so not only are ERVs a means of showing us that evolution happened, they're also a very good tracker and indicator of showing us roughly when various branches split off from other branches. We use them as markers in looking at that and in seeing how the evolutionary pathways branched off into all the different species we have. So, in looking at these ERVs, it's very obvious that there's only one explanation for how these varying species have certain ERV scars in common. The reason they do is because they have a common ancestor. That common ancestor was infected by an ERV, by an endogenous retrovirus, and that infection scarred its DNA, and that scar has remained in every species that has evolved from that common ancestor. That makes most sense. So in conclusion, these ERVs permanently scar the DNA. They do so in a way that causes the scars to be passed on to offspring. We have 16 locations in our DNA where we have these scars in common with chimpanzees. We have multiple more locations where we have them in common with gorillas, orangutans, gibbons, old world monkeys, new world monkeys, and other higher primates. There is no, I say again, there is no creationist explanation for these common scars between us and other species. What's their explanation? God created us all with those scars in common? What would be the point in that, other than possibly to trick us into believing that evolution occurred? The only conclusion we have, the only conclusion that we can come to because of this solid data, is that we evolved from a common ancestor.